Good morning, everyone. My name is Cathal Long. I'm a research fellow here at ODI. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. It's good to see people, some familiar faces that we haven't seen for a long time. And we're also really excited about some of the new faces that are here, as well as online. It's especially nice to see the team from the Development Policy and Finance team from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've been great supporters of this work. It's also nice to have colleagues from the IMF here with us and the Agile Foundation online, who've been great collaborators with us along the way. So this opening presentation is going to give a flavor of what this day is supposed to be all about. So let me start by addressing the elephant in the room. Why did we name the event, How Can Digital Improve Public Spending? I think for some people that probably reads a little bit strange. Why didn't we say, how can digitalization improve public spending, or digital transformation, or digital solutions, or even how can IT improve public spending? So it's not that we don't think these are important questions. It's that answering them answering them is necessary if we're going to have a digital revolution in public finance. But to answer them, we think we need to be thinking more holistically about what it means for public finance to be digital. So in preparing for this event, we published two working papers trying to lay out what we think it means for public finance to be digital and for the discipline of public financial management to be digital. And this is the definition of digital that we've been using within these papers and within our work. So it's a much more holistic definition than simply using technology, but it also involves process, business models, culture that are constantly being updated to meet people's expectations of the internet era. For public finance to be digital, we think three big shifts are necessary. This is what we're talking about mostly in these papers, and hopefully what we'll be trying to get across in the various sessions today. So the first shift we think is necessary is we need to stop thinking about PFM reforms and digital transformation as simply ends in themselves, but rather as a means to an end. The second big shift we need to see is a shift from a technology architecture for PFM that's currently very closed and siloed to one that is much more open, and which PFM is part of a wider ecosystem of data and services that goes beyond simply narrow PFM and covers government more widely. And the third shift that we think is necessary to realize this more open architecture is a shift from a solution driven approach to a much more problem driven and iterative approach to funding and delivering digital infrastructure for PFM. So to talk us through in a little bit more detail these shifts, I'm delighted to have my co-authors Marco Cangiano, James Stewart, and Emily Middleton here today. Both James and Emily are partners at Public Digital, who have been our primary collaborators on this work over the last year. And we're delighted that this partnership will continue. And we're also delighted to welcome Nick Gates to the team. Nick is here. We're very excited about the launch of a new initiative called the Digital Public Finance Hub, which Nick will talk a little bit more about towards the end of the day. But first, we're going to hear from our Senior Research Associate, Marco, here at ODI, who is going to talk more about clarifying what we mean by separating means from ends.
Morning, everybody. Real pleasure to be back here in this very room It was exactly almost 3 years ago. Lots of waters under the bridge. So, so get to business now. This has been a long sort of paper, kind of challenging, much more than expected. The idea was also to bridge two fairly dishomogeneous communities, the public finance, public financial management community, and all the, to me, still a kind of magic world of the IT and digital, etc. And the idea was really exactly to clarify a little bit the terminology, which I found quite a bit of confusion. I'm still confused to some extent. So that's the idea. The second point is we spoke about digital transformation, digital revolution, and public finance, public financial management, but gives the impression that public financial management, public finance, is kind of a steady, solid rock. Is not. It's quite fluid in terms of its definition, and meaning, and objective. So the idea is to have these two sort of dynamics, to bring them together, to give exactly what Kyle sort of alluded to, this idea of the digital transformation. For friends from ODI, what I'm going to say now in the next minute is probably familiar ground, but still let me repeat what public finance is about. Public finance is about setting policy objectives and goals for society. So it's about the what we want to achieve. Public financial manager, or PFM as we call it, is more how we achieve that. Unfortunately, and we may be responsible for all that, there's been a little bit of confusion. And now we ended up using PFM for public finance. So that what happened, countries have embarked in fairly ambitious reforms on the PFM front, try to address what I call the what, the policy objective. If you allow me to be technical for a second, introducing a medium-term expenditure framework doesn't give you by itself fiscal discipline or macroeconomic stability. It's just a tool, a process, a set of procedures. So that, again, goes back to what Kyle just said, is a means to an end, and we should really keep these things separate. Now, moving forward, bridging into the digital again, is the way I see it is, again, is another means to an end within PFM. If you approach that in this way, it can clearly open up space for PFM to be more efficient from a most trivial thing that we've all experienced. Just we process payments faster. We can use e-signature or platform of that sort. But the idea is exactly to cross from this sort of kind of achievement to open up a space within which public finance can also redefine itself and set objective goals that so far have been sort of being somewhat neglected, and we move into sort of issues that have to do with climate change and gender and inclusion and so on and so forth. So as the result of all this, what we've seen, as I said, countries introducing reforms that have been driven by so-called best practices, but also increasingly by IT solutions. As Matt Andrews used to say, these are actually solutions in search for a problem rather than defining problem itself. So again, the idea is to keep these things separately, understand what is a means to an end and what is an end by itself. So now, if we don't sort of agree and create some common ground, common terminology, the risk again is creating confusion. And instead of providing opportunity space, the risk, as I said, is missing this opportunity. So again, the idea is to conclude, we need to get these definitions right. We need to clear these distinctions. Otherwise, again, what we call the digital transformation, that will be another missed opportunity. And we've seen quite a few in the last few years. Thanks, everybody. James?
Okay. So I'm one of the people who here perhaps from a slightly different background. My background is as a technologist and a sort of digital delivery person. But I've been on a journey through thinking about how do we effectively fund digital initiatives through to realizing that actually there's some much more fundamental opportunities to think about how do we work on public finance more generally, drawing on lessons that have emerged from the kind of digital revolution that we've been through. So I'm going to talk about this shift in the approach to technology. I know there's at least one other person in the room who remembers the internet as it was on the left of this slide. But over the last few decades, the internet has kind of permeated our society. And we've been on a journey of learning to provide services at massive scale from a sort of technologist's point of view, and to do so in a wide variety of innovative ways. And as individuals, as citizens, as organizations, we've become far more familiar with using rapidly developing technology in every aspect of our lives. And that creates a new opportunity for us to think about how do we harness what we've learned. Along with that, the technology world has changed and developed quite rapidly. We've introduced cloud services that make it much easier to kind of pick up basic infrastructure for technology very, very rapidly without the big upfront capital investments that we've had to have, and open source tools that let us build on what communities have developed, which fundamentally changes the way that software is built and run. And if you think about how we tend to use the internet, you often have multiple ways to use a service. So interacting differently on a computer versus a mobile device. But we trust that the data underlying that is kept consistent. And that's enabled by a set of open standards that have evolved through communities and a lot of effort. Those open standards let us move from a kind of one-size-fits-all solution to any problem to thinking about a range of tools that are designed around the needs of different users and the contexts in which they're operating. So, for example, rather than just having one module, which we might use to solve a problem in every situation, we can think about perhaps slightly different tools designed around different business processes, say in line ministries or different parts of an organization. It takes us away from the needs to kind of have a sharp distinction between what do we do once and centralized and what do we do in a federated way, and gives us a lot more options. So this picture is the CEO of a bank in Peru, drawing out the core architecture that underpins the kind of technology of his bank. And he was doing that to understand what things might he build on top of that would meet the needs of different banking customers, including the unbanked. Because he knew that if he had that fundamental architecture right, he could deliver a wide variety of services to a wide variety of users, rather than just that one-size-fits-all answer. And as we start to think about breaking out of that one-size-fits-all approach, as we start thinking about how we can change our architectural approach to things, we start thinking a lot more about data. And Paul, sitting in the back, did a lot of work in the UK government. Others have been doing similar work around the world, thinking about how we can move away from all of our data being locked in large monolithic systems provided by vendors and only easily used for the intended use case at the point at which some software was commissioned, to trustworthy registers of specific data sets, which can be you can focus on the specific quality of them and you can repurpose them for different use cases as we go, meaning that we can do a lot more to introduce new types of analysis, new types of data flows, and bring more people into a conversation about whether we're using that data and understanding the financial reality that it often represents well. So we've gone from rapid growth of the internet to growing sort of consumer understanding of it and skills to develop with it. We've got new tools and new architectures that we can bring to bear to create much more open systems and a lot more options for how we meet people's context. And that lets us think very differently about how we design and support services, and how we move into this thinking much more about the ends rather than the technology means that we're in. In order to do that, we also need new delivery approaches and new ways of working, which Emily's going to talk about now.
Thanks, James. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that third shift that we need to see in delivery and funding models. And many digital initiatives, as many of us will have experienced, like introducing new accounting or payroll systems, still tend to follow a really linear model that looks something like this, a waterfall approach. And typically a business case is written and approved up front, then passed to another team to write really detailed technical requirements, followed by often a very long procurement process, and then a period of development by a vendor or customization of an off-the-shelf product based on those initial specifications, but that by this point might have been written several years ago. Typically, when circumstances change, it can be quite costly and cumbersome to adapt. And all this is done sequentially, and it takes a really long time. And a World Bank study found that on average, the introduction of a financial management information system takes 8 years. And indeed, in many cases, it takes much, much longer. And it's an obvious point, but in 8 years, an awful lot can change in terms of technology, in terms of society, and how people behave, and indeed government policy. And so the resulting IT system at the end may or may not actually meet those user needs that it was designed to at the beginning. So by contrast, and agile approaches emphasize the importance of really defining outcomes up front and investing in an initial period of really understanding the needs and incentives of different user groups and the constraints and the context that they're operating in. There's a real focus on regular feedback loops and on prototyping early to test the riskiest assumptions, whether those are assumptions about technology and about how systems integrate, or about how people will use a system and how they'll behave. Agile approaches make it much easier to identify problems early, but also to adapt to changing circumstances. They really involved a shift in mindset and in culture. And over the last 10 years in particular, there's been a really growing movement, actually across all sectors, but also across governments around the world, to move from waterfall to more agile approaches in delivering digital initiatives. And indeed, in the 2020 Standish report found that on average, digital initiatives that adopt agile approaches rather than waterfall ones are 2 to 3 times more likely to succeed. But we think, and we discuss in the papers that Cahal mentioned, that finance ministries have been slower than other parts of government to embrace these newer delivery approaches. And we think that one of the impediments to that is that the funding and governance models that finance ministries and their development partners tend to use haven't sufficiently adapted to really support agile delivery. They still assume that kind of quite linear waterfall process that I outlined earlier. And we typically see funding still going to define technology projects or solutions rather than to, say, a multidisciplinary digital team that's empowered to iterate towards set outcomes and use whatever tools or approaches best suit those needs. So in summary, we really need to see a shift from funding IT projects to funding digital teams and outcomes. And this sort of third shift is of the 3 that we've kind of talked about today, is one of the main issues that we really hope to pick up in that final panel session of today, which will include experts both in digital government as well as in public finance. So with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Mark to introduce the first panel.